I'd like to introduce Dr. Angela McClanahan. And Angela's background is in anthropology, and it's from this perspective that we kind of asked her to sort of frame a discussion around beauty today, and I think it brings, yet again, another sort of dimension to the discussion. Angela teaches lectures at Edinburgh College of Art, so I'm sure she might be familiar to a few of you, actually. And as I said, her background is in anthropology and archaeology. So I'd like to introduce Angela to give her presentation. Thank you. What's this called?
Right, okay. I'm going to talk to you about art, beauty, and anthropology in 20 minutes, I think. And I was just saying to Dave, actually, I'm hoping that this presentation actually will end up in a kind of similar place to Dave's in terms of this idea of beauty and collective subjectivity. And on that note, interestingly, with the kind of last questions that we sort of had for Dave from the audience, I think it's important to kind of, sorry. Yes. I simply have to point out at this point that, yes, Dave, there are actually anthropologists who are Marxists as well. So I just wanted to kind of start on that point. And also, this slide, actually, I picked out this image, which is by a Guatemalan contemporary artist who showed this particular work at the Venice Biennale this year. I'll explain what it is just now, and then I'll come back to it in the very sort of last slide. But it's a piece called Looting, and it was something that she produced in 2010. Some of you might be familiar with this work. What it was basically is the artist is based, she's from Guatemala, and is a performance artist. And what this work is about is that it was a kind of metaphor piece where it engages very much with the idea of sort of post-colonial sort of politics and so on, because basically these are 8 small pieces of gold, and when I kind of confronted them or saw them at the Biennale, it kind of draws you in because they're quite small. They're under this sort of glass, and they sit on this kind of pillow. They struck me immediately aesthetically as very beautiful objects. What they actually are pieces of Mayan gold that she instructed a Guatemalan dentist to drill. Guatemalan dentist drilled 8 holes in each of her molars and inserted what she considered to be Guatemalan gold of the highest quality into her molars, and then she flew over to Berlin, where I think she's sort of practiced for a few years now, and had a dentist in Berlin extract these from her teeth. And so performatively, metaphorically, this was kind of an engagement, and it was, again, sort of in relation to the title, Looting, an engagement with the idea of sort of Western pillaging of Mesoamerican lands. So I'll come back to why I think this is a beautiful object through kind of my anthropological background and so on a little bit later. So that's what the work is about. But where I want to kind of start, the first slide, again, sort of starting in a kind of really big way, and again, this is such a sort of vast subject to try to kind of discuss in 20 minutes. But I think a lot of you here, certainly the students that I see out in the audience, will be familiar with the relationships between art and anthropology, particularly things like the relationship between particularly late 19th and early 20th century classification systems of things like indigenous art within museums that have informed art historical discourse. Also more recently, perhaps, the ethnographic turn, and this is particularly related to contemporary art in the last kind of 20 to 25 years or so, where you get contemporary artists engaging with the idea of conducting ethnography, which for those of you who aren't familiar with anthropology is the kind of method du jour of anthropology, where you go into a specific, the old-fashioned idea, I suppose, is that you go into a specific culture for a long period of time and engage in observational techniques, participant observation, interviewing people, basically hanging around as a kind of legitimate sort of method for trying to get to grips with how a culture works, also cultural change over time and so on. So in the kind of 90s and 2000s, this sort of idea that artists could kind of engage in this sort of methodology to produce artworks has kind of gained currency and is kind of standard practice in relation to things like working with found objects and the idea of site-specific art particularly. So those are kind of ideas that are perhaps familiar to you. Also, this sort of engagement with art in terms of early to mid-century, I suppose what you would call relativist schools of thought in anthropology, particularly in places like the United States, that kind of had moved on a little bit. Anthropology has this kind of very sort of, obviously it's a kind of, it has a colonial past, and it was originally a discipline that engaged with, as I think we were talking about earlier on, this idea of the study of, the Western study of the other, okay, so non-Western communities. So moving from kind of quickly from 19th century perhaps, what we would now regard as quite racist ideologies that would have dictated how we classified and understood other cultures and what we kind of measuring their kind of value systems against what we might see as kind of Western standards of beauty. For example, the idea of being, having different kinds of classification systems for whether cultures were civilized or whether they were barbarian. The kind of, I suppose, most famous relationship between things like check marks for civilization were related to a kind of classification schemes where you might sort of classify a society based on the fact that it might have primitive art that might make them kind of a step up from savages into the kind of classificatory scheme of being barbarians. But in order to kind of have civilization, you would have to have quite sophisticated high art rather than just kind of what you might call primitive art. So from the kind of, we have sort of late 19th century ideas pervading how anthropologists classified art in those kinds of ways, moving on quite quickly again to the sort of mid-century relativist schools of thought that regarded culture as kind of taking and picking and choosing from what at that point were considered, after I suppose some of Darwin's ideas, universal forms of human behavior that were kind of woven together as suggested in this kind of landmark study by Ruth Benedict, that you could kind of, that cultures were discrete units that would pick and choose or kind of engage with a set of universal human behaviors and weave them together to make their cultures unique. So one of the things I want to say about the relationship between art and anthropology in the 20th century and into the 21st century is that this is a discipline largely coming out of the 19th century, but in the last kind of 100 to 110 years or so, it does recognize that beauty is a subjective thing. And what I want to talk about here is the kind of theoretical kind of issues it's had with itself and kind of grappling with why this might be and the kind of theoretical underpinnings that kind of characterize how we actually understand subjective beauty within different cultures, because it has changed quite substantially over the last sort of century or so. So that's just kind of a quick overview. What I'm going to do first is talk to you about, well, first of all, before I kind of go any further, I wanted to say that the idea of dealing with aesthetics actually has been, even though we kind of talk about the relationships in a wide sense of anthropology and art, but I want to say that aesthetics has been a particularly sporadic concern within anthropology, and that especially recently, this sort of reticence to deal and to even kind of wade into the sort of murky depths of aesthetic analysis lies with the reticence of contemporary anthropologists to kind of try to make judgments about the aesthetic qualities of work in this sort of globalized world that we lived in, that we kind of currently live in, where disciplinary, cultural, and social boundaries are sort of heavily blurred, they overlap. The ways that we understand and use methods to kind of analyze subjectivity and beauty and so on are so blurred, they're so informed by quite complicated relationships between disciplines, but also the kind of ever-expanding kind of cultural contact facilitated via technology and so on, okay? So anthropologists are reticent these days to make these judgments in the first place, perhaps more than they were, again, kind of throughout the 20th century in particular. What I want to do first of all is to kind of give you a broad overview, perhaps a kind of more popular understanding of what it is anthropology and its constituent methods can offer. Like, how is it that we actually judge aesthetics and beauty and so on? How do we come to kind of make these judgments about subjectivity and how particular cultures and communities and so on recognize aesthetic experience and beauty? And I'm going to kind of take three overlapping categories here, which were written about in 1996 by Willifred Van Dam in a kind of a book called Beauty in Context, which is, it's a useful text, but again, it kind of engages perhaps with the more, I suppose, a more kind of traditional idea of what ethnography is and how it can engage with the idea of aesthetics and beauty. And the three things that she says that anthropological analysis can offer aesthetics and how it kind of can help to understand aesthetic experience, perhaps in different ways than things like art historical analysis or philosophical analysis, are first of all that it's grounded in experience, okay? So this means that you're going out and doing field work, you're engaging with communities in a kind of long-term way, you're looking at how they engage with artworks, you're looking at perhaps ideas about how and kind of experiences in which art is being produced and so on. So it's the idea that these observations are grounded in experience. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly for this discussion, is that anthropology also, of course, is a social science that's engaged with, it's in fact dependent on looking at things in comparative perspective, okay? So this is a key argument when it comes to things like beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is something that's kind of very relative and dependent upon the conditions which produce someone's cultural understanding and engagement with the world. Okay, so comparative perspective, very, very, very important in this regard. And also the fact that it's contextual. So based on the kind of previous 2 points, that it's grounded in experience, it's grounded in comparative perspective, these 2 things mean that you can kind of, over a long period of time, and again, the kind of traditional, we call this a Malinowskian view of anthropology, Malinowski being the kind of, I suppose, the father of modern anthropology, who kind of first engaged in living in a particular culture for a long period of time. The traditional kind of length of time was about a year or 2 that you would live in a community, engage with it. So over this period of time, this meant that you could build up a context for people's behavior and how they engaged with things in the way that they did. So first, to kind of expand on these ideas, the sort of first idea about grounding things in experience. So ethnography is a kind of empirical pursuit. I know empiricism for a long time, since the advent particularly of postmodernism, was a word that everybody is really afraid of, but it's kind of coming back, I think, into the fore in terms of we can almost now kind of come back to this idea that we are producing empirical data in a kind of social scientific manner, however, but which is not something objective that you kind of make logical deductions from, but that's something that's actually grounded in experiential kind of understanding. Things related, if it's, for example, your field work might be paired with a kind of phenomenological, philosophical perspective on the world and so on. So ethnography is a kind of, it's an empirical pursuit. It makes it, I suppose, different than art history in that it's looking at a kind of object within its, if it's art you're concerned with, it's looking at this in a kind of broader context of social relationships. So again, ethnography, its primary method, which kind of is an umbrella term for living in a community, doing interviews with people, watching what they do, participating in what they do, and so on. So this ethnography kind of produces dialogic exchange with communities and also kind of gives you, again, builds up this idea of context. Again, long-term fieldwork enables anthropologists to see and understand patterns of behavior over long periods of time. And also, again, the sort of experiential nature of it is really important. Also elaborating a little bit on comparative perspectives here. Some of the really crucial questions that anthropology throws up, and I'm not saying that these questions are exclusive to anthropology as a discipline when it comes to things like examining art and beauty. But it asks these questions that I think are crucial to the sort of discussions of beauty. Can there actually be universal standards of aesthetics and beauty? Is this actually a possibility, or is everything relative according to the kind of norms that you live in your own culture? How is it that these kind of norms might be conditioned? How might your kind of understandings of beauty, for example, be influenced by your background if you're a practicing artist, or you went to art school, or you kind of studied art history? These are obviously all things that are going to shape how you think beauty is constituted. Anthropological methods also ask what are the similarities between cultures' aesthetic values, but also, again, where are the points of departure, okay? And again, this idea that an anthropologist's background themselves, it's not just the kind of people you're involved with, but also your engagement as a subjective sort of being in a community, the way that you read, the way that other people read things is going to be informed by your particular perspective as well. So how does the anthropologist's background inform how she understands the aesthetic experience in a different culture to her own, okay? So comparative perspectives, there's a lot of kind of subjectivity and sort of those kinds of issues here that have been recognized in anthropology and anthropological methods over the last kind of 20 years. So again, sort of to kind of recap, those are the kind of overarching, perhaps, questions and so on that using anthropological methods can engage when we talk about this idea of subjectivity and beauty in anthropology. And I want to kind of speed through the sort of historical trajectory here that I want to kind of discuss and I think is relevant to this conversation. So mid to late 20th century scholars then kind of progressing on from, I think I mentioned in a couple of slides back, about how in America, in the kind of early 20th century, you had anthropologists who kind of very much believed that looking at culture, you should kind of look at the relative, and you should look at it in a really relativist way and kind of understand cultures according to their own norms and values, and that cultural behaviors and practices were something woven together from a kind of sort of huge array of human behavior. So kind of moving on from that into the sort of mid-20th century, and here we're talking about kind of 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we moved to a kind of more the sort of theoretical analysis within anthropology that adopted some of the kind of analyses that we might find, for example, within structural linguistics, which I think it's interesting to note that within anthropology departments in the States, linguistics is actually part and parcel of an anthropological approach. So it's kind of seen as a different, it's part and parcel of anthropology there. So you kind of see a real influence of things like linguistic analysis, semiotics, and so on, that were adopted by scholars. Some of you might be quite familiar, for example, with the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was quite interested in Yoruba aesthetics in particular, and looking at the kind of subjectivities involved in looking at how they kind of understood beauty. And he looked at these in terms of kind of, again, the sort of moving on from the kind of culture and personality relativist schools of the early 20th century. You're looking at these things as quite, these behaviors and understandings as still relativist, but quite encoded in structural kind of norms and behavior. So really borrowing sort of heavily from, again, linguistic analysis, so that you could kind of see how these behaviors and understandings and recognitions of beauty and the production of art objects were kind of coded based on structural underpinnings. So it was kind of thought that there was particular malleable structures, but yet structures nonetheless that perhaps underpinned culture in particular areas. And I think the difference where we've kind of, I wanted to mention before again I moved on, is the kind of landmark studies that we still kind of, I suppose, in anthropology and sort of sociological analysis, very much see value in, and as Dave mentioned earlier, you also get, for example, the kind of landmark analysis, Bourdieu's distinction, which was a kind of long-term sociological analysis in which he kind of engaged in field work, kind of looking at surveys of art museums, particularly in Paris, places like the Louvre, where he kind of did long-term, and we're talking about a period of over about 10 to 15 years or so, where he was kind of conducting interviews and looking at how people engaged with art in Parisian society, and kind of coming to the conclusion that the subjectivities there were based, again, on people's cultural background, their kind of status within their society, the education that they had, their sort of class, and so on. So again, we kind of really, within anthropology, sort of see a lot of validity in this approach. But again, it's sort of quite like the Lévi-Strauss sort of analysis of culture. This is still kind of engages with this sort of very structured ideas that are kind of very structural, and that they kind of insist that there are structural underpinnings that are perhaps less malleable than we would now acknowledge within sort of, I suppose, postmodern or pseudo-modern anthropology, or whatever we're sort of calling it these days. So again, and I think one of the sort of interesting things about this, although a kind of still a very influential and valuable study, is that the kind of Bourdieusian ideas about reading art and our engagement with art are more about art and its institutions, rather than looking at particular art objects and their affect on people. So it's kind of looking at the questions concerning institutions, power relations, and so on, rather than necessarily looking at, again, the function of individual art objects. So still valid, really relevant, but kind of nonetheless sort of aesthetics within anthropology kind of was moving in a kind of different arena kind of around the 80s and 90s up to today. So I kind of want to talk about this sort of this idea that there's been an aesthetic turn within anthropology as regards art these days that very much informs, and it's very controversial, and where I'm actually going to end up is sort of doing a kind of reading and a sort of, I suppose, bigging up of certain scholars within an area of anthropology and archaeology and sociology and art that might seem a bit more controversial. There's certainly kind of perspectives that aren't wholly adopted within the disciplines. But I quote here Suzanne Cooler, who is a kind of significant figure in looking at anthropology and art, who's associated with a school of thought known as, and my students will, anybody who's been in a class with me will kind of be familiar with this term, but who's associated with the kind of school of what we call material culture studies. And she said in 2002 that the aesthetic turn in the anthropology of art was itself motivated by a post-structuralist reading of cultural form. While insisting on the multivocality of authorship, earlier studies coming out of West African ethnography were fatally coupled with a residual insistence on narrative and linear modes of analysis. Howard Morphy's call for a cross-cultural study of aesthetics appeared to shed the linguistic paradigm as his analysis focused on the emotive and physiological associations of cross-hatching, the sort of one of the techniques associated with Australian Aboriginal bark painting. It was soon followed by an anthropological study of the cultural eye based on Jeremy Coote's study of the poetics of color terms attached to Nilotic cattle. And much of this work was influenced by a move away from romantic, transcendental ideals about the Kantian disinterested aesthetic to a self-involved, often corporeal response to works of art. Aesthetics appeared thus not part of an exterior outer reality, but as an entity integral to every aspect of social life. Okay, so she's saying here that this kind of engagement is kind of all-pervasive, that it's not just sort of an external factor that impacts upon you, but it's kind of a sort of, if we think about it in more material terms, perhaps more dialectic than that. It's kind of all-pervasive, in other words. And this brings me to, and again, I feel like I'm really kind of overgeneralizing a lot of these sort of points here. But this brings me finally to kind of one of the main scholars that has had the most, I suppose, controversial, but also perhaps the biggest influence on the relationship between art and anthropology over the last sort of decade, certainly, or now coming on for sort of 15 years ago, Alfred Gell's Art and Agency. Now, Gell was a kind of very controversial figure. He was an anthropologist, quite a polymath, interested in things like temporality, art and agency. And in 1998, he was diagnosed at the age of 51 with cancer, and he was actually writing this groundbreaking book at the time when he was diagnosed, and I think probably perhaps because he knew he didn't have long, made it as controversial as he possibly could. And so what we're left with are a bunch of kind of almost propositions that are argued with, but of course I think it's kind of his last laugh because we kind of obviously haven't seen where he's taken or where these things could have possibly gone according to his analysis. But some of the things that he said in Art and Agency were that an anthropology of art had so far failed because of its attempt to understand art in terms of aesthetic appreciation. Okay, so thinking back to kind of Claude Lévi-Strauss's analyses of Yoruba aesthetics and so on, where kind of he said too much emphasis was put on this idea of aesthetic sort of appreciation. He said that anthropologists needed to stop borrowing from other disciplines' methods, and being a British anthropologist, again, here he would see linguistic analysis as being something very separate than social anthropology, as in the British tradition. He said that anthropology needed to kind of use its own methods and ground its own ideas about art in relation to its kind of discursive methods. He kind of insists here also on breaking with this idea of using sort of text and reading everything as a text and using everything in terms of, anthropologically speaking, with semiotic analysis, and also said as well that we as anthropologists need to stop sort of simply regarding, when we talk about art, we kind of simply look at non-Western art. He's saying we need to have an anthropology that looks at contemporary art as much as anything else. Okay, so these were kind of very serious, very kind of almost damning propositions in his sort of last work that have gone on to kind of obviously disgruntle some and inspire others. And basically what he proposes in this work, Art and Agency, is that we need to sort of see artworks as vehicles of thought. Okay, now I'm not saying that he's kind of divorcing some of these concepts that he's employing from things like that we've talked about earlier that inevitably do come into art historical analysis. They do come into philosophical analysis of artworks. But he's saying that we need to specifically in anthropology do what anthropology does best by looking at how artworks actually transmit culture. He says that they are things that should be recognized that mediate and are also agents of social relations, and that affect and enchantment are related to and embedded in shifting entanglements of culture, economy, and social relations. Okay, again, so that overlaps, I think, with a lot of perhaps what Dave was saying, but it also kind of embeds, I suppose, this sort of analysis specifically in an anthropological context, in that this is the kind of first time. And a lot of people regard this as ridiculous and completely mad, but he says that we need to treat art objects as if they're people, and we need to kind of look individually at the individual objects' impact on other people. And when you kind of you have a viewing experience, you should be sort of regarding an art object as a person that has agency, or in other words, the ability to act. Okay, so he's saying that this is what anthropology does best. It looks how artworks can kind of mediate social relations, also to kind of, we need to recognize them as active agents. And I suppose departing from, I mean, it's kind of similar because we're sort of still going with this idea that artworks and the appreciation of them and the understanding of them is subjective. So looking at something and recognizing its beauty is still something that's very much sort of, within the eye of the beholder. But he talks about this in relation to a wider networked world where you don't have, culture isn't bounded, perhaps in the way that Ruth Benedict would have kind of discussed in an anthropological context in the 20th century. Cultures aren't kind of unique, and never were actually kind of unique sort of units that were kind of hermetically sealed, but that actually are kind of boundaries are malleable, understanding and meanings change over time. And Gell was saying that we need to look at things in a kind of wider network of continual cultural change. And I think cultural change was the kind of malleability of it is the kind of point of looking at artworks, I suppose, as living beings that kind of transform and are vehicles for transformation on social and cultural relationships, and therefore cultural change. And so I think what I wanted to say then in conclusion about this particular artwork is perhaps in looking at this particular piece of art as perhaps transformative, kind of going towards and pairing it with something like a collective ideal. This particular work, this sort of metaphor for challenging and kind of understanding and getting to grips with the kind of colonial encounter, and how sort of the kind of colonial relations are certainly ongoing in places like Central and South America, certainly Mesoamerica. The sort of colonialization isn't just something that's kind of, we need to think of as over, but it's kind of ongoing and related to kind of the sort of capitalist production that's quite oppressive in terms of people's kind of engagement with the world. So this particular artwork is a kind of metaphor. It's, to me, the thing is beautiful because it shows a commitment to sort of a kind of political kind of engagement, an aesthetic engagement with the world that's about changing the world, about acknowledging this kind of ongoing oppression that people are suffering in the world. And so it kind of embodies and kind of activates a kind of perhaps a kind of emotion within the viewer that there's somebody that's this dedicated, that things still, if someone's willing to go with their body to this kind of length to kind of perform, I suppose, a particular kind of politics, that things aren't necessarily, the status quo isn't acceptable, that things, we kind of still need to kind of be seeking radical change. And so I think that this perhaps is a kind of small example of the kind of engagement with particular forms of art in the way that kind of Gell recognized that art actually is an active agent that has the possibility to kind of call forth and stir these kinds of emotions in viewers, okay? So the idea, I'm going to leave you with Alfred Gell. I think that's where I'm going to sort of end the presentation here, but the idea of objects having social lives, I think, is really quite an interesting and perhaps overlaps a bit with some of the things that Dave was saying about collective subjectivity, but certainly kind of a provocative way of looking at art. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Angela. Okay, I'm aware time's running away with us, so maybe I'll just take one question from the floor, and bear in mind we'll have time after everyone's presentation, so you can sit on your questions till then. But does anyone have a pressing question, comment at the moment, either from the floor or maybe one of the other panellists might have something to say? I don't want to hog this session, so yes. Could we have the mic over here, please?
I'm just interested in the idea of like art and material culture having an impact on social relations, and I was wondering if you could expand maybe on this example of the gold in the molars, because it evokes an emotional response, but where does it actually make a difference in social relations? What social relations?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I suppose the idea within material culture studies about objects having agency is the idea perhaps that it should be recognized, the kind of dialectic between, and Danny Miller, who is actually kind of one of the most famous Marxist anthropologists, insists on this idea that there's a dialectic between human beings and the material world. And so at its most basic, it's that we work on the world works on us in I mean, it's kind of quite an abstract concept until you start to think about things like Dave was talking about, modes of production and so on. So in looking at how things impact on us, perhaps a metaphor for this might be something like Brechtian theater, for example, where where the kind of mode of presentation of theater is challenging the kind of institution of theater in and of itself, and kind of perhaps, I suppose Brecht's idea was that by being confronted with the power structures that actually underpin performativity in a theater kind of context, that and by kind of performing, I suppose, sort of politically, highly political, kind of engaging productions, that the audience member would be perhaps the kind of emotions that it would stir would kind of entice the viewer or the audience member into kind of becoming politically active, for example. So by looking at this, again, it's kind of perhaps the recognition that you might be stirred by the kind of plight of the Guatemalan people and their kind of relationship with, for example, the United States and all the kinds of sort of trade issues and the oppression that's still happening in Guatemala at the moment in relation to kind of capitalist production. So I suppose in this kind of instance, it's that you're going to kind of be transformed into kind of becoming politically active, for example, which hopefully will have a kind of positive change on the world. I think does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It just doesn't seem to happen in practice. I guess that's why I was wondering.
Sorry?
I guess that's why I was wondering, just because it doesn't seem to actually translate into practice. Like, I don't see people
it depends on
at the Biennale, like, going off to Guatemala.
Yes, I mean, obviously, kind of looking at this sort of, the place where it was displayed in the first place, you can't disassociate the power associated with the kind of, the place where it's displayed. However, I still don't think that necessarily takes away from its emotive, like the content of what's kind of happening and the impact that might actually have. It might cause one thing to kind of happen that then impacts on others.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela.